Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Modern Maze. I hope that you're having a beautiful day so far, and I trust that you're looking after yourself, your loved ones, and your community. I'm really excited to bring you today's episode. I had a fascinating and insightful conversation with Emma Bacon, who is the founder and executive director at Sweltering Cities. Emma is a passionate campaigner, organizer, and activist who has worked across social and environmental justice issues for over 10 years. And her organization, Sweltering Cities, is Australia's only national campaign and advocacy organization working specifically on issues related to extreme heat. 2023 was our hottest year when we look at the global temperature on average, and it appears as of right now that 2024 is going to break that record. 2024 is also expected to be the first year in recorded history that we go 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. When I say pre-industrial levels, I'm speaking to the time before the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution was when everything began to rapidly change. Our relationship with Mother Earth changed, the rate at which we had production and consumption going, the industrial machine, how much we began to destroy our planet. It was a turning point. And so pre-industrial levels, specifically talking about global temperatures, is often used as sort of a marker to refer to. So 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Why is that such a milestone? It's a significant one because this amount is exactly what the Paris Agreement aimed to avoid. In 2015, world leaders, they pledged to prevent global temperatures from rising by more than 1.5 degrees, and definitely not 2 degrees. The climate science showed us that going up to 1.5 degrees would mean just an absolute terrible time for the planet and for us as a result of that, and all other beings that inhabit it. And this was such a landmark moment because this is when all of the world's nations, for the first time, they agreed to cut the greenhouse gas emissions that were causing global warming. Now, you may also be hearing a new narrative about 2 degrees and 2 degrees being the actual target. And you may hear this from political leaders, or it could be CEOs of big corporations. But 1.5 degrees was the target. That's what the climate science had shown us. Now, we have failed to curb global warming, as we promised, for many reasons. But I do still believe and pray that we will be able to get this back on track, and that it's not like we've hit 1.5, so it just means we're going to go on forever. There's plenty of work being done to stop that, but there's a lot that we need to do as well. Sometimes I don't want to admit it to myself, but climate change is here. And while we talk so much about climate change mitigation, which is what do we need to change in today's world to repair our relationship to the planet, to stop the activities that damage her, what are the ways that we need to build new infrastructure and new systems and new technologies to support a more sustainable way of life. We also need to think about climate change adaptation, which is to say that climate change is here. What do we need to do to adapt to these new conditions? The first time that I consciously really began to ponder this was the IPCC report that was released a few years ago, which is the gold standard by climate scientists from across the world that talks about the effects of climate change and what does it mean now, what does it mean for the future, what do we need to do to stop it. It's a huge, huge document, and I would highly suggest anybody checking it out who's interested in this, and I will include it in the show notes. But the thing in that report that stuck out to me the most was they talked about the fact that the damage that we've done to the earth means that we're going to be feeling the effects of this for at least the next few decades. So that's to say that if in some alternate reality, tomorrow we manage to stop doing all of the things that damage this planet, we would still be feeling the effects of what we've done so far for the next few decades. So the earth has the amazing ability to heal and repair, but we have to give it time. The earth runs on a different time to us, a different time scale, right? Like the earth works in millions of years, and that's the time frame. So we may wait and want the earth to heal naturally, but it takes time. And so we need to be prepared for the climate change that's here and that's expected to increase. And that's what today's conversation is about. It's about extreme heat. Who are the communities and people that are most likely to be affected by this? And what are the things that we need to do to actually address the issue and to help build resilience towards extreme heat? Because extreme heat is here for the next little while, and it's expected to increase. There's more and more heat waves are expected. So it's not the end of it. It may just be the beginning for this next little period. And I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but there are things that we can do. We just have to be advocating for them and actually implementing them, because there are people all across the world that are suffering as a result of this. And the most interesting thing, at least for me, about this discussion is the fact that it's the vulnerable communities that get hit the hardest. And this is not something that is unique to extreme heat. Across all of these climate change effects, it does disproportionately hit vulnerable communities, whether that means low-income households or people with pre-existing health conditions, people with disabilities, the elderly. These communities are the ones that feel the effects the most, and the story of extreme heat is no different. At the end of the day, addressing extreme heat, as Emma so eloquently puts it together, is that it's a story about inequality, and addressing that as a true path towards helping people adapt to these new conditions. All right, let's jump into our conversation with Emma. I hope you enjoy. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will speak to you next time. Namaste. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Modern Maze. So glad to have you here. I am thrilled and honored to be joined by Emma today, who is the founder and executive director of Sweltering Cities. And Emma, thank you so much for joining the podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm very well today. This is a funny time of year for us because we get busier in summer as it gets hotter, and lots of other people are sort of winding down for the year. So, you know, it's always a strange period for us, but I'm really excited about what we're going to be doing over the summer.
Great to hear. So I was wondering if you could just start by telling us a bit about the heatwave problem, about sweltering cities, and sort of the goals that your organization is working towards?
Yeah, sure thing. So I guess to begin with, something that's really important for people to know is that in Australia and across the world, heat waves are the deadliest environmental disaster. In Australia, they kill more people than all other environmental disasters combined, including fires, floods, and storms. People call them the silent killer sometimes because when people do pass away or the really drastic health impacts, people often feel that in their home, in their workplaces. These are private tragedies, often without those big images that we might get of floods, fires, or storms that really communicate the scale of the damage. Often we're really underestimating how dangerous heat can be. We've been working at Sweltering Cities for almost 5 years now on, working with communities who are most impacted by extreme heat in hot homes, hot suburbs, hot workplaces, more and more now hot towns and regional areas, to advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable communities. When we started at the beginning of 2020, we were primarily focused in Western Sydney. Western Sydney is really like the hottest region of Sydney. It's inland. It's next to the Blue Mountains. It can be 10 to even 15 degrees hotter than the coastal suburbs or surrounding rural areas. It's what we call an urban heat island area. All of our cities, lots of our towns have them. And so we started working with those communities, driven from the beginning by conversations with people who were saying, I am just feeling these sense of dread. I can feel the impacts on my health. I'm worried about my community. I'm worried I'm not going to be able to afford to keep cool, but no one's doing anything about it. And, the buildup of having those conversations and looking around and saying, someone should be doing something about this, and eventually saying, well, I guess we should do something about this. And that was the founding of Sweltering Cities in 2020. And since then, we've really expanded from Western Sydney to now have an on-the-ground presence in Melbourne, in Sydney. We had someone in Queensland last summer, and we're looking to expand to WA. So we're now truly a national organisation trying to put heatwave impacts on the agenda for the federal and state governments. I think our goal we can describe as putting the community voice and community experience at the heart of decision-making and better policy-making when it comes to heat. In this area, sometimes we consider, lots of climate impacts, but maybe heat specifically as a health issue and, with physiological causes, and I can go into that. But really, the heat wave risk is driven by structural inequality. So what we're doing is trying to have a cross-check, sector systems approach to say, this isn't just about giving people individual advice about how to be more heat wave safe. This is about saying, we need to collectivize this issue. It's not about putting a wet towel on the back of your neck, even though, that can be a good thing during a heat wave. It's about saying, how can we fix our housing system, our transport system, what's going on in these hot suburbs, hot homes, hot workplaces to make people safer? Because otherwise we're just going to see growing risk as climate change really cooks our cities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess for those who are not in the know about specifically the urban heat island, I believe it's called, and the problem with modern cities, could you explain what's going on with our cities? Why is it 10 to 15 degrees hotter? Yeah, what's happening there?
Yeah. What are urban heat islands? Great question. Well, urban heat islands are areas where the physical changes in the area, physical construction is heating up that area. And what's happening is you might have, very few trees or no trees, so there's no shade or evaporative cooling. You've got dark surfaces like dark roofs, dark roads, things like that attract more heat. And then you would have sort of concrete, bricks, the type of materials that capture and then radiate heat back out. So it's not just, hot during the day, but it also these areas can have much hotter overnight temperatures as well. Mm-hmm. And I think for people to understand it, one of the best ways we think about it is this is the difference between standing under a tree in a park on a hot day and walking down, a street in maybe an industrialized area where there's no trees, there's just lots of concrete. And I think that will bring to mind for lots of people that difference when it comes to the physical materials around us. What this also means is that even though we have climate change heating up our cities like ovens, we need to both address climate change, but also look at how we've built our cities, how we will build our cities, what we can do to, regenerate, invest more in green design and better materials. We need to tackle both of those things.
Absolutely. I think when I started looking into urban heat waves and heat waves in particular, I was surprised, but also not surprised that it's such a big systemic issue that's tied to things. And we can get into this in a little bit with things like cost of living, building standards, and then obviously the big things going on with climate change. So it really is such a multifaceted problem, I would say. And I guess just for your organization with the advocacy piece, how have you guys managed to strike a balance between sort of addressing these local climate impacts, but then also engaging with that broader narrative of climate mitigation and adaptation?
Totally. So I think like thinking about these binaries or these, things, separate ends of a spectrum around like mitigation, adaptation, local, global, things like that. A lot of the time, I think people who are policymakers or people who want to advocate for a very specific thing are like, here is the most important thing we can do. And unfortunately, the most important things we can do are complex and big and bloody heaps of them, right? And so actually, I was just mentioning that the way we build cities heats them up, but also the way we build cities makes them really carbon intensive. So if you think about the urban sprawl on the edge of our cities, some of our hottest suburbs, where their homes are being built to a energy standard that's not high enough, where there's not enough solar panels, or there's not enough trees, but also it's a really car-focused environment. It's just not enough services. We're really locking in, really carbon-intensive, urban areas for decades to come, and we're going to need to retrofit so much of that to become sustainable. So, when we're thinking about mitigation and adaptation, it's also saying in order to reduce electricity consumption or switch more efficiently over to renewables, we need to approach the same problems that are also creating the urban heat island effect. So I think that those are things we've got to understand. That from the beginning, when we were talking about the beginning of Sweltering Cities, some people said to us, adaptation is giving up. We need to be really focused on mitigation. That's the name of the game. I think from the beginning, we've understood that you can't work with the communities that we work with without acknowledging that they are already feeling the impacts of climate change. You've really got to come to people and understand, especially when it comes to heat and the people we work with, that they understand that, the difference between the summers of their childhood or even 10 or 15 years ago is not what they're experiencing now, and it's not what they feel like the future holds for them. And unless you're able to speak to that local experience, to engage people about these questions of climate, I just think you can't have a legitimate, honest conversation that resonates with people. And it also is a matter of I think putting climate, connecting climate impacts to people's everyday concerns. So there is, I think, a conservative anti-climate narrative that said, anti-climate action narrative that says, investing in sustainability climate action is too expensive. We need to, not upgrade housing design. We need to focus on doing things ways that they describe as the cheapest. And even though, cheaply built housing is not affordable to live in, there is that, narrative in the media and from anti-climate action politics. But we know that, we speak to people all the time who are saying, we just can't afford to keep cool. We can't afford to turn on air conditioning. We can't afford to live in a, higher energy efficiency rental house. It's overwhelming, the idea of taking their kids to the shopping centre for days at a time over summer. And so those everyday concerns that are fundamentally economic, health concerns people feel every day, we are connecting the bigger climate narrative to that in a way where people feel like they are important agents in this change. This isn't about COP. This isn't about, degrees of warming necessarily. It's about saying, Western Sydney is going to get to 50 degrees and what that feels like more than, what 2019 might feel like at a global scale. Not that that's unimportant, but it's harder for us to make that the center of the narrative. It's more important to say, what is it going to feel like to live in Australia's hot homes, hot suburbs, and work in hot workplaces as we feel those temperature extremes? Like, that's the real heart of the conversation. And it's extremely powerful. Like, I learn something new every week about how people experience heat in Australia.
Mm-hmm. I think it's beautiful bringing that real narrative that people are living in the now and bringing that to the forefront of the conversation. I think is such a important thing. And I think that even I've learned a few things just by reading through some of the stuff that Sweltering Cities has done, right? Like, I think even in Melbourne, it's funny, we were talking about, urban design. I feel like there's a difference when, this is for people who live in Melbourne, but I go to a place like Coburg that's a bit more industrial, and there's warehouses everywhere, and there seems to be a lot of concrete. And I don't know, I noticed that I feel really hot there. But then I go to a suburb that's out of the city, like Warrandyte or something, and it's much cooler. I know that those are very big polar opposites, but I think that just having that, I don't know, that conscious awareness about your daily routine and how you're feeling. And I think air conditioning is such a problem in that it is such a huge polluter, and it's such a big, I think it's one of the biggest contributors of global electricity use, and the demand for it is
10%.
just kind of 10%.
Yeah. 10% of global energy is used for air conditioning.
Wow.
Like, that's wild, right? And it's projected to triple.
So it's just, I don't know, it's kind of like we're just stuck in a loop that's getting worse and worse. And 10% and going to triple, that's a huge amount of energy. And so it's not as simple as to what you're speaking about. It's not as simple as just chuck on the air conditioner and the fan. And you spoke about the marginalized groups. Could you explain, I guess, who are these marginalized groups, and how does extreme heat disproportionately affect them? You touched on the cost of living. But yeah, what are the other patterns that you've observed in Australian communities?
Yeah, I think, one of the most powerful recent stories I've heard from someone, I think, to really illustrate this, is I've been doing some work in the northern suburbs of Melbourne with women from migrant communities who are carers, like who have kids or look after parents, things like that. We've been doing it with RMIT University. And I spoke to her, I met a woman, and she's a single mum from Pakistan background, and she lives in a rental home that gets really hot in summer. And heat has a different character everywhere in the country. In Sydney, it's really that western suburbs, it's really the geographic areas most impacted. If you go to Queensland, humidity is a huge issue for people. In Melbourne, so much of how people experience risk and the impacts of heat is in terms of housing and low quality housing. And in Melbourne, you have those, it's not hot for a few hours each day. It might be hot for 36 hours and then drop 20 degrees. So it can be those really hot nights as well. And I was talking to this woman, and she was saying she lives in this house that gets really hot in summer. She's been asking her landlord for aircon, and they say maybe. At the moment, there's nothing in the rules to say that landlords have to provide a fan or aircon in homes in Victoria. Hopefully that's going to be changing. And that on hot nights in summer, she'll bring both her kids, who are both under 5, into her bedroom. She'll point the cheapest Kmart fans, it's all she can afford, directly at her and the kids, but she will stay up all night worrying about them. She can see them tossing and turning. She can see them sweating, and she's just so angry. And, she told me that she'll stay up late at night, typing emails to her landlord saying, we have asked again and again for cooling, and you haven't acted on it. My kids are really sick. If something happens to them, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to feel? And then she wakes up in the morning and she deletes the email, and she just said, there's nothing I can do. There's no rules to protect me. There's nothing I can do. I think that's just one of thousands, and actually tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stories from across the country of where we see the intersection of climate and inequality and the health impacts that it's having. Not just the physical health impacts, because people do die, as I said, but also the mental health impacts and the social impacts. Because, we have, we know that really tragically, suicidality, mental health crises, increase with temperature, but also so does domestic violence. There's evidence saying hate speech, in fact, increases with temperature. So there's other social impacts. And it's people with the fewest resources who are most impacted. As I said, in Melbourne, lots of it's to do with housing, but across the country and in lots of places in the world, the hottest suburbs with the least trees and the highest urban heat island effect are also the poorest suburbs. And VCOS, the Victorian Council of Social Services, has in fact done a study overlaying the heat effect, the heat island effect, with poverty for different local government areas, and found that I think 5 or 6 of the hottest suburbs are also the poorest. So that's places like Brimbank in the west of Melbourne, where you have, a really high urban heat island effect. It can be 9, 10 degrees hotter, but also you've got people who, just don't have the option of going somewhere cooler. I spoke to a doctor who works at Sunshine Hospital, which is in that council area, and I said, "Oh, it must be really busy on hot days." And he said, "Yeah, it's busy in the emergency room, but actually the really sad thing is that people die in their homes and they're not found for a few days because they're really isolated people often who are older or people with disabilities." And, that is, for me, just this, these are avoidable tragedies. We know, what is causing this risk. We know the low quality homes and, disability and chronic illness and lack of resources to say, well, it's actually too hot in my house. I'm going to move somewhere else. I'm going to go to a hotel. I'm going to get aircon. That's actually what's killing people. You can overlay, across all our cities, you can overlay maps of the hottest suburbs with things where the majority of people, more people with disability live. You can overlay it with income and find that people with the lowest income live in those areas. I've seen a report of child poverty specifically, and the areas with the highest child poverty rates are also the hottest suburbs. And so then you think about kids walking to school on hot days and what it would be like to live in a hot home, to walk to school on streets that in Western Sydney and South Australia, across the country, might be 40, 50 degrees. You're a little kid and or even a big kid, whatever. And how are you meant to learn? How are you meant to pay attention all day? How are you meant to really throw yourself into your studies if you're exhausted and hot and dehydrated and you're going home yet again to a hot home night after night? And, it's these type of things that, again, it's not rocket science. We don't need to study complex solutions for all these problems. We can see that it's about inequality. We can see it's about poverty. We can see it's about, discrimination that people experience for different reasons. But we can actually say we're going to solve the problem. And, we might not be able to stop heat waves. We know heat waves are going to get worse, but we can actually prevent heat wave disasters. But we've got to really be getting to that, heart of saying, these are big issues that require really ambitious programs, and it's got to start with poverty and housing injustice.
Mm-hmm. 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 And when we're, speaking about people passing away in their homes, which is just, a horrible mental image, what are the reasons that hate has this effect on people? What happens to somebody when they're stuck at home and there's no aircon and they're feeling the heat? Physiologically, what's happening in those moments?
Yeah. I'm not a science person, so everything I'm about to say has been absorbed from other people who are science people. But I can tell you, I know a fair amount about this. I'm happy to sort of describe it. The people who, we understand as traditionally most physiologically at risk are people who, for different reasons, their bodies are less good at moderating or maintaining their internal temperature. So that's little babies, really high risk, older people whose bodies aren't as efficient as cooling their bodies, people who are pregnant, people who are on lots of different medications, including antipsychotics and antidepressants. that might change the way your body can manage internal temperature, which includes pushing the blood around the body, sweating, things like that. What also, if we're thinking of people who specifically have risk, one of the reasons why we're significantly undercounting heat deaths and heat-related illness in Australia is because often when people go to hospital, they're not being registered as oh, you've got heat stroke or heat exhaustion, even if they might have heat exhaustion. They're often there because of crises that are cardiovascular or respiratory, because people who might have existing cardiovascular problems, it puts even more pressure on your heart to pump blood, to cool yourself, and then that causes a crisis. So people are being maybe registered as a heart attack or in respiratory crisis, because that's one of the underlying causes for them that triggers it. So even though heat is a problem, what it does is it's exacerbating existing illnesses. I think that's one of the most important things. If people do want to know the real detail about how bodies are affected by extreme heat and heat waves, a couple of years ago, The Lancet, which is a international medical journal, one of the best, did a whole series, two whole editions on heat health that has lots of really up-to-the-date, important research and detail on it. So I'd probably recommend people go there for more detail.
Do you see a future where, in Australia, we have a slip, slap, slop. I think there's a fourth one now. Shade.
Yeah, there's 6 now.
Oh, there's 6 now.
Something like that. There's 6 notes. Light on some sunglasses, sit in the shade, something like that.
I was going to say, sounds like we're taking heat into account already in that, because, in Australia specifically, you hear all about the sun and staying out of the sun, but it really sounds like we need to really think about the heat as well. And even the kids walking to school, throughout all those moments in the day, how do we bring awareness to that? I was wondering if we could maybe draw out the link just a little bit more, if possible, between poverty and social inequality and being in these areas that are urban by design and less nature and less greenery. So is it just a matter of funding and attention and discrimination? Sort of what are the reasons that these marginalized people find themselves in these urban areas that are prone to the urban heat island effect?
I think it's partly due to historical planning, and it's partly due to underinvestment now. So to tackle the first one, from the 1950s onwards, and even before that, Australia really adopted the American model of a car-centric city. So lots of urban sprawl, big distances, wide roads, things like that. And, if you think of, people might think of different Australian cities about, what it's like to be in the inner east of Melbourne, around Prahran, places like that. You've got lots of narrow streets, back streets with trees, things like that. Or the inner west and the eastern suburbs of Sydney, again, really mature trees, more parks, things like that, also closer to the water. And then you've got sort of the sprawling suburbs where you have a combination of industrial estates, but also, again, suburbs and communities that are intended to be navigated by cars rather than by people, fundamentally. And areas like that are internationally across the world in Los Angeles. As I said, these hot suburbs are often places where the poorest people live. They're just the development of, I guess, these working class communities that were living in suburbs dominated by car usage rather than older, richer suburbs, has also over time, I guess that has been entrenched by having councils or like state and federal government investment that doesn't really tackle like these issues. Like we still have a far bigger investment at a state level in more roads than we do in bus infrastructure, for example. In Sydney, the state government doesn't even consider themselves responsible for bus shelters. They say it's a local council problem. But what that means is that if you live in a rich council or a council where advertisers really want to put their car ads in front of more people, then you'll have lots of bus shelters. But if you live in a poor council where advertisers might not be as interested, you are not only more likely to have a disability, be low income, live in a hot home, but also you're less likely to have that public infrastructure. And it's these type of decisions that are about like not having an equity-focused public policy when it comes to transport, housing, tree cover, things like that. Like if you look at, like, let's say, again, like looking at Melbourne, this is true in lots of places, the coolest, leafiest areas are lots of the older suburbs or the wealthier suburbs. And then the west, the newer sprawl, just home to some really like amazing, vibrant communities, people who are really, having incredible community connection. There's suburbs like Derrimut in the west that has 1% tree cover.
1%?
Like 1%. And so the venue, like, so it's really hot, right? And so when it's really hot, you can't leave the house, but there's also like an underinvestment in services. So people are less likely to be close to libraries, community centres, things like that. So I'd say that, it's that the problem of planning around, like, from the middle of the last century, sprawl that made people like further away from community services, often further away from employment and things like that. People have spent more time getting to employment and the jobs that are closer, more likely to be blue collar jobs and white collar jobs like in the city. But also, it is that entrenched disadvantage over decades of like underinvestment from government in terms of like, great schools, lots of blue and green infrastructure, which is like parks, but also waterways and things like that. That puts like, there's such good work being done by local councils in Western Sydney, Western Melbourne, Southeast Melbourne, across Queensland, everywhere in the country, local councils are doing their best, but there's just such a huge gulf in resources between some of the richer suburbs and cooler areas and the suburbs, like, in more disadvantaged areas where there's a lower rates base, but they're having to provide like much more support for communities that really need it most. So I think that's one, like services and planning are the two reasons.
Yeah. And from what I'm hearing, it seems that a lot of the good initiatives are being led by specific councils, but perhaps not the state and the country. Is that a fair assessment or is...
Yeah, definitely. Like local councils across the country are really doing the heavy lifting when it comes to responding to extreme heat. Like they're the ones who are working directly with community members to, have community responsive adaptation, community driven resilience. They are the most embedded and connected. They're often doing, they're implementing either green programs that might be funded at a state level, but they've got to be implemented by local government. And in lots of my experience around the country, local government understand the problem and are really eager to step up or continue to step up or continue to provide support for communities, whether that's opening libraries longer hours, it's, changing planning controls, it's like supporting multicultural organizations to do specific outreach with, maybe recently arrived communities who haven't experienced a hot Australian summer before. I know that's like programs exist like that. Unfortunately, the state, there is no state with a good heatwave plan. Like there's just, there's citywide ones that are improving, but like New South Wales doesn't have a good heatwave plan. WA doesn't have a good heatwave plan. Like the federal government certainly doesn't have any heatwave plan. And if you look at, it's just really, I think, anti-science to think that the Australian government isn't going to see like a massive crisis that crosses different jurisdictions. And, they're really focused on understanding and measuring impacts, like what they call sort of like policy leadership. But they themselves don't have a plan. If you look at like Europe a couple of years ago, you had heat waves that were like from like weeks across the summer, lots of different countries. 60,000 people died in Europe a couple of years ago in the heat and summer. It's like a really shocking number, but also like, there was a week in Spain when 7,000 people died, so like 10 days in Spain. So these are really big fatality events. And, it's not unreasonable in Australia to think about a really extreme heat wave that, is across Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney all over a similar time or the same time, and that having huge impacts on our supply chain, on our health system. If the power goes out, like what that would do to vulnerable communities, to workplaces, to social cohesion, if people can't access resources. Like heat waves are more like COVID than they are like storms, right? Like the impacts will be long-term, they'll be systemic, and like, there's all these different federal systems, whether it's like social security or, like the emergency management system, all things like, it is just, I think, I think it's quite anti-science to think that like Australia won't have heat waves that the federal government doesn't need to respond to.
Mm-hmm. It's a big issue. And I think so I've been in India for the past couple of months, and India had a really big heat wave earlier this year as well. I think it hit well over 50 degrees in Delhi, and there were thousands of people dying. And it's when it appears like that and it's such a big issue, it really pops out at the screen. But I think do you think it's lack of awareness on the government's part, or more of, they're just not focused on it right now? Or is it a little bit of both going on there?
I think maybe 2 years ago, I would have said to you, I think the state and federal governments don't really understand the level of risk. And that's not true anymore. Like they really do understand, mostly like the level of risk. But there is a conscious push from the federal government and like often from state governments as well to push responsibility for managing heat waves, extreme heat impacts onto individuals, onto local council, onto already like underfunded and really busy community organisations. And that's everything from, people who provide community services to community legal centres, to domestic violence services, to mental health services. Those are the organisations that are absorbing this risk that we know of. Like we already know that this risk exists. We know that these problems exist. So it's being absorbed, like it's a conscious decision to push those organisations to absorb the risk without, like, or individuals or local government, without empowering them to like be part of the solutions more. Like state and federal governments still control planning controls. Like they control the transport budget and the health budget. And like state governments control like the renters rules like, across the country. So
building
like
codes, I'm sure.
They're pushing responsibility to people to like, sorry?
I said, would it be building codes as well? Or building standards,
codes are state and
all
federal.
of that? Yeah.
Both.
Mm.
Yeah, all of that, right? And like, that's like an example is like saying, oh, like it's really hot. You need to keep yourself safe. Like you need to drink lots of water, stay smoke, things like that. But we're not going to update the rental minimum standards that say your landlord needs to provide a safe environment. And it's like, so it's pushing it onto individuals without taking responsibility. And that's one of the biggest problems. Like what we're trying to do is push responsibility upwards with community power, with advocating with other organisations, with this evidence of impact, push responsibility upwards onto state and federal governments who like just need to be part of the solution instead of actually often now like being part of the problem.
Mm. And so you mentioned in the past 2 years, you think that they weren't aware, but now they are aware. Have you seen any indication of a shift in their willingness to play into the space since Sweltering Cities has been around and been advocating for heat waves?
Look, I would was reticent to take credit, but I think that what we've done with that storytelling work that we do, with putting it to decision makers, with, really presenting extremely tangible solutions, whether again it's about rental standards or planning standards, or it's about bus shelters, or it's about fixing railway social services. Like, we're putting forward really specific solutions for government, so they're not like, oh God, we've got to invent the wheel. I do think we've had impacts there, and like we're definitely sought out now as like the national community voice on heat safety, which is great because it gives us a lot of opportunities to push for the things communities want, which is great. And yeah, like I think I don't want to underestimate the really fantastic work being done, especially by health departments, in understanding and managing the risks of extreme heat. Like there is like really serious work being done across the country and at a federal level. The problem is that you cannot isolate this problem to health departments. Like you have to address the sites of risk, not just the symptoms of risk. And that's why this needs to be a whole of government question. And we've got to see more leadership at a premier or a prime ministerial level to say, like, yes, this should be a government priority. We've decided that we find the idea of thousands of Australians dying over summer in the heat, or hundreds of Australians dying even, we find that unacceptable. And we're just not going to live in a future where that's true. And therefore, we are going to fix X, Y, Z in order to, like, that's the sort of commitment and leadership that's actually needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's about doing all of this amazing work and getting that recognition before the big event happens, if God forbid it does happen, right? And preparing our communities and our health departments, everybody for that. It will happen.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time, unfortunately.
Heat's one of those things about climate change that, like, like there's no mystery. Like heat's the one where we like have the global benchmark. There was a report yesterday saying that we're on track for 2.7 degrees of global warming. That's global. It's going to be hotter on land, and it's going to be hotter in our cities. Like, we had one, like, almost 5 years ago in Penrith and Western Sydney, it was 48.9 degrees. Like, that's not going to be an anomaly. Like, that's going to happen. It's going to get over 50 degrees. Like, this is, and it's just true. It's just a true
it's
thing.
A fact
like,
at this point.
That's what science tells us. Yeah.
And with even more people living in cities than ever before, I think it's half of the world's population, or maybe even 60%, and it's just continuing to go that way, trend that way. This is such an important thing. There's going to be more people moving in. There's going to be, you're so right about Western Melbourne, like amazing food there, by the way. I love the food. Best.
Agreed.
Best.
Yeah.
But as more and more people move in, I'm seeing all of these new developments and these new suburbs and these new areas, and all of them, they have those, I don't know, like black asphalt roads and black ceilings and not much greenery. And so, yeah, as more and more people pile into cities, we need to be proactively thinking about how we're actually building this. And yeah, like that's where state and federal really come into making these sort of bigger changes, and putting it on the individuals is, yeah, that's a tough position to put someone in. It really is. And especially we were talking about, the cost of living crisis, something that interested me, or well, not interested me, but something I hadn't considered about heat waves and is the social isolation as well. I'm sure will be is such a big factor as well. Like, I think about specifically lockdowns and sort of the after effects of that, and a more isolated society in general, from what I notice and I think is the truth. To me, that's something that worries me as well, is that with more heat waves, people just stuck inside, isolated, like you were speaking about, DV issues and mental health. I see that as a real problem as well, just being isolated indoors separately as a result of the heat.
And it is, in any disaster, like, isolation is deadly. Whether it's a flood, like, whether it's a fire, it's a storm, it's like your connection with your neighbors and your community is one of the ways you can be safest. And that's true before, during, and after disasters. And isolation definitely kills in heat waves. And again, it's that social crisis of you've got people who are really isolated and they live in areas where even leaving the house on a hot day, if you're an older person living in a hot suburb, it's been 35, 40 degrees for a week. You might not be leaving the house. You're not going to appointments. You're not seeing your friends. You're not socializing. We've done these big summer surveys and found that huge numbers of people across the country are saying they're avoiding exercise, they're avoiding socializing, they're avoiding running errands on hot days, which is all leading to socialization, specifically really a risk for older people who might not have the same social networks, workplace networks that other people have. There's Council of the Aging, New South Wales has just put out some really powerful reports about the shockingly high numbers of older people who are experiencing social isolation. And it's that, tragic story of people feeling like they're too unwell to leave the house, but also not necessarily understanding how much risk they're at themselves in their homes. And it's not just death, obviously, that's the most tragic thing, but also having a worsening of your illnesses, or increasing, disease, getting worse, chronic illness getting worse, that also has this long tail of impacts on people where, they may have a exacerbation of disability, mental health crisis, things like that, that also, it's not just on a hot day that this affects people. It can be a long time afterwards. I think that's, I know something that's been an international discussion with different people and about how social cohesion and community networks and the sort of understanding social infrastructure beyond physical infrastructure and more about the networks people exist in, and prioritizing funding for the type of organizations that are social connectors. I spoke to someone who, we work with someone who works at one of the neighborhood centers in Melbourne. She said one of the people who visits their neighborhood center recently said to them, when I'm here is sort of the only time I hear my name, week to week, because, her kids live pretty far away and they call sometimes. Her husband had passed away. She might go to the shops and things like that. But, when she arrives at this neighborhood, people say, "Oh, hi, Susan. It's nice to see you, Susan." And she's like, "Well, this is some of the only times I hear my name." And just that story, really, it gets me personally, thinking about people living like that. But it also shows the importance of, community centers and neighborhood houses, multicultural organizations, disability services and advocacy organizations. All of these organizations are just so important for climate resilience. These are not separate. These are not separate worlds. These are the same world.
I think that's absolutely true. It's all interconnected. Based on, I guess, jumping into solution mode now, we talked about the problem. So I guess based on, you mentioned your summer surveys, and I know that you do a lot of work with the communities and on-ground surveys. Can you, I guess, elaborate or describe any areas of solutions that have been raised by the communities and how they're being addressed today?
Yeah, totally. When we started, after the first couple of years, we were like, okay, well, we think there's 3 big buckets of solutions. And those first buckets were safe homes. So, making sure that we have better rules for renters, that we are retrofitting and upgrading low energy efficiency homes, that every social housing property in the country is safe in a hot climate. That's a really urgent one. But also that includes things like planning and energy efficiency standards for new homes. So let's not be creating low energy efficiency, expensive to live in, hot to live in homes. Now, we need to, everything we build from now on should be safe in a future climate and help us get to a net zero carbon emission future. So that's sort of safe homes. The next bucket is cool suburbs. So that's everything from trees and blue infrastructure, like waterways and stuff like that, to having great public transport, really accessible public transport, including bus shelters, services. If we're having new developments, let's make sure that people can travel by really accessible, fantastic public transport. That could also include things like shading parks. We talked before a little bit about like the Cancer Council, SLAP, that sort of stuff, like being safe from skin cancer. Having shade over playgrounds is a really simple thing that we can do, along with putting bubblers and bathrooms there. Say like this is a cool place for people to go in summer to socialize, to be with their kids, and it just like those few degrees, or maybe even more than that, difference degrees to the touch or in the air at a playground just makes them a lot more accessible and cooler. And the third bucket that we originally had was basically no one being left behind. So let's make sure that we are enhancing our like disability support, domestic violence, mental health support for people during heat waves. That really proactive, accessible healthcare could also include having a phone register where you the Red Cross or government, like the Red Cross does it in South Australia, calling people who we know are at risk and checking in on them and saying, how are you feeling? Do you need support? Do you need to go to the doctors? And addressing that isolation question, like that's about social cohesion. And more, we're also thinking about food security in that bucket, and how to make sure that, the enormous number of Australians that now either live in severe food insecurity or day-to-day are struggling to put food on the table for them and their families or skipping meals, that a heat wave doesn't exacerbate that crisis for people, whether because of supply chain issues or, again, not being able to leave the house, to go somewhere cool. So those were our first three really practical buckets. But after a couple of years, what we also saw is that it's not just about, government doing these programs or communities like participating in these programs, but also there's a bucket around justice and participation. So, the best way to make communities, workplaces, homes safer into the future is to make sure that people can participate in deciding like what a livable, equitable, sustainable city looks like, empowering them to participate in design, infrastructure, planning questions, and not in a way where it's filtered through like well-meaning or maybe not so well-meaning consultants who are saying like, here is the narrow version of what you can participate in making a decision on, but actually saying like, we know that the people like who live in a suburb, who live in a town, have a real interest in it being safe and their communities being safe. What does that look like in a more participatory way? But it also includes the self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when it comes to well-being and environment, and really looking towards the like Indigenous knowledge in this country, in this continent, where like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for tens of thousands of years have been like living with like on and with country in a really adaptive way, but also, fundamentally have also had to adapt and be resilient to like the crisis of colonization and the genocide. And we are lucky enough to live like with like on a continent where you have this science, like tens of thousands of years of science, of connection, of community, of design, of innovation, and that both, self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in designing, whether it's the housing, communities, health systems, well-being, justice, like fixing the justice system that they specifically participate in, but also, saying like, how can we lift up the principles, the ways of working, the ways of being in relationship with country that come from those communities in order to help heal all of our collective relationship with country in order to make it more climate resilient. I think that bucket is where we put, like, obviously it informs everything. But like that's something that really became clearer and evolved, and we articulate a lot more. And, stand in solidarity, of course, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the other thing I would put there as a bucket is, like in that bucket of justice and participation, is about unions and workplaces and making sure that workers have the rights and the support to advocate for and design safe workplaces and safe work practices. Because we know that the most vulnerable workers are the most insecure workers. So when that comes to garment workers in hot rooms, garage in suburbs, or food, like agricultural workers, who are working on farms without protections, without support, who are often migrant workers. We need to make sure that every workplace in Australia has a climate safe plan and a heat safe plan, and that unions are empowered and supported in the workplace through OH&S reps and others to really be at the table in designing those plans.
Thank you so much for running us through that. It really sounds like an amazing, holistic way of looking at this. And I love what you touched on, specifically with community and the Indigenous perspective as well, taking that into account. Just quickly, speaking about participation, how can people get involved? How can people reach out? How do people get involved in the work that Sweltering Cities is doing today?
Well, the best thing for people to do, I guess there's 3 things we can do. Follow us on social media. We're probably most active on Instagram. So if you're on that platform, keep an eye out, share what we're sharing over summer. You can go to swelteringcities.org, and it will prompt you to sign up to our email list. That's where we keep regular updates about campaigns, about news, things like that. So please join that email list. And there's also a Get Involved tab there. So if you'd like to, get in contact, have a conversation with one of our community campaigners about either a local issue, or if you'd like to support our work in any way, we would really welcome that. I got a message a couple of days ago from someone who's a postie, the post deliverer, mail deliverer. And they're saying I just want to share my story. There is no plan. It is so hot. I don't know what we're going to do over summer. And even people getting in contact to share those stories of your everyday experience, that helps us build out this evidence to demonstrate the collective problem. So really encourage people to get in touch via our website.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for jumping on the show today. And thank you for all the work that you're doing at Sweltering Cities. It really sounds, just incredible how you're taking that on the ground narrative and building it up, right? It's the bottom up, but top down approach as well. So yes, I love all the work that you're doing. And yes, thank you very much. And I hope you have a beautiful day.
No, thanks for having me. I hope you have a beautiful day as well.
Bye, everybody.